Laura, thank you for being here with me.
Oh, it's my delight. I'm so excited to be here and help you.
This is amazing. I've really admired a lot of the stuff you've done over the last 2 decades, maybe now. A lot of your insights back in the day of AMR, and I'm going to get into that. But when you came through the front doors today, you said you just were at a conference and you were talking about, various topics. One of them, lead times.
Yes.
And in the world of supply chain, we
Yes.
tend to misunderstand how important time is.
Absolutely.
We make it sometimes so complicated. So I just want to throw the ball at you. It's like, what did you talk about lead times?
Well, I was invited to an executive track to
Sure.
talk about how can we use streaming data off of logistics for giving us insight into lead time. And I think that as we think about supply chain, we've really operated in the world of known knowns. So we have known inputs for known outputs. But in this world that I think has become increasingly gray, we've moved from black and white to more gray, more uncertainty. How do we drive better reliability in the face of uncertainty?
Right.
And one of the opportunities, I think, is to use all the data that surrounds the supply chain, which about 80% of the data is not used, to not just look at lead time as a constant, I'm going to set it and forget it in my systems, but to use machine learning and to use new techniques around artificial intelligence to understand the patterns of lead
Right.
time, that it's a variable and it has patterns. So perhaps selecting a supplier X versus supplier Y will
That's
give
right.
me better reliability, or perhaps that, a certain carrier will give me better reliability, or maybe something's happening on a lane where I've got better insight, maybe with the Baltic Index or a drone flown over a port that can give me better insight. But unfortunately, people don't think about lead time as a variable to manage, and they set it and forget it. And if you think about lead time, it's extremely important in a lot of our decisions,
Yeah.
from how do we calculate safety stock, how do we calculate replenishment and DRP and VMI, how do we look at material requirements and MRP,
That's right.
how do we think about a procurement plan, what is the tactical horizon in sales and operations planning. And I find in my research only a half of 1% of people are actually thinking about lead time as a variable versus thinking about it and forgetting it.
I love that because, we talked about it earlier, right? Supply chains are made up of quantity and time, and the one just moves through the other. And time, obviously, defined by lead times for so many things, because it's not just the lead time from a supplier to me. It's then also the lead time to produce, then the lead time to get to my customer. There's multiple lead times throughout this thing called supply chain. And what we find in our little world that we live in related to SAP enterprises, as you said, people set it and forget it. And you're lucky if what they set was even correct the first time.
Even close, right?
Even close, right?
Yeah.
There was like, oh, I think it was 10 days. Let's just put 10 days, we'll fix it.
Yeah,
We never do.
right.
And so as you think about time, it is about setting it firstly correctly and then optimizing for that, right? Because you want to shorten lead times. That's cost, that's waste we want to reduce. And then to your point about then giving, the ability to be a competitive advantage. We talk a lot of customers try to put lead times in as instead of an available to promise. So instead of being able to say, I can actually give you 5 items tomorrow and the next 2 that you wanted in a week's time, which is available to promise, right? They say, well, we don't really know because we have an unpredictable supply chain. We're going to just say everything's 2 weeks to our customers. And you're losing market share because of that, because you're not staying competitive, because you're not giving your customers. It's a little bit like Amazon. When we all order from Amazon, we've been trained by Amazon. We get what we want, and it tells us when the lead times will, when the next batch will come. And we can decide if we like that or not. But God damn it, if that thing doesn't arrive on the day you wanted it, right? But I love that you bring it back to those fundamentals because we can sometimes overcomplicate supply chains.
Well, I think we overcomplicate it, but there's so many things that we can do simplistically that can improve the supply chain. So I just want to pull my hair out when I read, the hype around real time. And I'm like, most of our processes should never be real time. Let's talk about getting data without latency to the people at the speed in which they need it,
Yeah.
and having it reflect the market, not necessarily some factor that I put in when I implemented that you're right, probably has no representation to reality. And the other thing I find is people don't use their own data to, learn, about, perhaps it's a manufacturing conversion because lead time should be the combination of all those cycles together.
That's
And
right.
they're all variable. And we can learn and improve on the variability. And the more variable it is, then the greater the bullwhip. And unfortunately, people don't measure the bullwhip, so they don't measure waste.
Right.
And we talk about improving reliability and reducing waste, but we're not thinking about what's really the basics behind supply chain, which are conversion of atoms and the management of time.
There we go. Thank you. That's exactly, I've been saying the same thing for 20 plus years. I love it. Thank you for validating that. The other thing too is that you talked about own data. I love that because, again, in the world we live in, ERPs is your enterprise. It should be your single source of truth. And from this level of data, you should be able to have incredible insights, right? And one of the things that we see is that the data that's often in the system does not reflect reality.
Right.
And so nobody trusts it. And then they default to spreadsheets and workarounds and all these other, shadow systems. How do you think that impacts businesses when we refer to that as kind of operational drift? You move away from kind of some of the leading practices and standard system capabilities.
There's a lot there. So let's dissect that.
Yes.
So first of all, I think we got to say, why are people using spreadsheets? Is it because our systems are too slow and they can't get the data when they need it? Is it because there's an issue with the semantic reconciliation layer? Because our systems on the traditional side were very black and white. They were very much about schema on write, and everything had to fit in rows and columns. And so we lost a lot of the semantics of an attribute or a grade or a lead time. Or, the supply chain is really about gray, and it's not about black and white. But our early supply chain systems were all about black and white. An item was an item. It didn't matter that it had a grade or that it was packaged differently or that perhaps it had 3 representations of each, or it was phase in, phase out for some product or dependent demand for another. It was a product. And so that whole semantic around that, we've lost the gray. So that's the second thing. But the third thing is usability. If I think about, the people that are coming into the supply chain, they're used to a whole different level of usability with their phones and it's putting them in front of our traditional systems, which I came from green screen to ERP, right? I thought that was really pretty cool. But, the kids that were getting out of school are like, what's this? I'm going to build my own.
Do it on their phone.
Yeah, I'll do a spreadsheet on my phone,
That's right.
And the fourth is our systems don't always allow the adaptability for what's happening in the business at the speed that the business needs. And so I need workarounds. And I think those workarounds create black holes. And then the fifth thing is I think that we've got a little bit of maverick behavior, and sometimes people like to be heroes with their special spreadsheets, right? So I think,
They white knuckle those things.
we have to say, why do we have spreadsheets? And how do we help the ERP system to truly be the system of record and to be a good system of record? Because it is so important to align the organization, because the organization fundamentally is not aligned.
Yeah.
And so that system of record threads through the functions to align. And that's why it worries me when people talk about making ERP real time or making planning real time, because we need a good system of record.
We do, 100%. So if you think back, I'm going to go a little personal now. So you've 2 decades of research from AMR to Supply Chain Insights, your own company. You produce a lot of reports, a lot of insights. You're somewhat contrarian sometimes. You love to challenge. What do you think is the most misunderstood element still within the supply chain community? if you had to kind of say, people just are not getting this, what would that be?
Well, we probably don't have the hours to have this discussion, but I think the concept of the supply chain is a complex nonlinear system.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that in a first principle level, we moved from order to cash, procure to pay, transactional efficiency to constraint-based theory.
Yep.
But we really never embraced supply chain dynamics, the J. Forrester work, which led to the bullwhip effect. And there's nothing that is at the performance layer that says, do I have a good plan? Am I driving value?
Yeah.
And so that movement at a first principle level from constraint theory to supply chain dynamics, I just do not think is well understood at all. And particularly in this world of variability, we have all these practices that I think are kind of like Band-Aids, like risk management, or, I'm going to have a control tower, where really I think there's no place for risk management. I think it's the balancing of risk and opportunity, and it's about decreasing the latency so I can make good decisions. And I think it's about design and modify the supply chain, which will lead me to my second thing that I don't think is well understood. I'm a chemical engineer by background, so I was
fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
Back in the 1970s, much to my parents' chagrin, I decided I wanted to be a chemical engineer.
What did they want you to be?
Well, my dad wanted me to be a teacher, which was very gender appropriate.
Yeah.
And my mother's like, nobody will ever hire you. And my big brother's like, yeah, you're right, Mom. Nobody will ever hire her, right?
No, I don't believe it.
And yes, but I got a scholarship because I had to pay myself my way through school. And at that point in time, thank heavens, I was able to do it. So I was like the only woman in my class in chemical engineering in the 1970s. And I was really struck by the concept of design. I had to design heat exchangers and distillation columns. And my first jobs were in manufacturing, and we designed manufacturing lines. And we had, process control, and we had brochures and manuals and, how, quality conformance, quality design. And then I worked in R&D, all about quality design. And then I got into supply chain. And I'm like, what is a good design of supply chain? And I found out that, only about 9% of people actually design their supply chains. And I'm shocked. And so we've moved on the capability side that we can now run designs with a much easier to get skill level, easier to use, and they're faster. And we can design and modify the supply chain with each cycle of sales and operations planning to be able to look at form and function of inventory, to be able to look at, how we convert atoms and, where we should have push-pull decoupling points, et cetera. I won't bore you with what I know, but we don't do it. Design still is kind of this ad hoc process that people, it's kind of like, Thanksgiving dinner, I'm going to do it once a year and, I'm going to leave it and forget it versus thinking about how do I design the interrelationships between source, make, and deliver to make things better, and what does good look like?
And the care and feeding of that continuously.
Correct.
It's this notion of, as you said, set and forget it, or one design fits all. It's like, it doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work.
Well, it does work, but it costs a lot of waste, and, people, aren't very happy in their job. The third thing that surprises me about supply chain is the dissatisfaction of planners. One of the most popular blogs that I've ever written was written on Valentine's Day, and it was, have you given your demand planner some love today? And the demand planners actually have the lowest level of satisfaction of anybody in the supply chain.
Fascinating.
And, as we think about job satisfaction, most of our planners spend 85% of their time in meetings. And then that doesn't allow them any time to plan. And I'm also shocked at how little most executives understand planning. Often they'll say, demand error's too high, go fix it. Versus, I have, error associated with my product group, right? And so those three things bounce around in my mind a lot as I just don't understand. And I just try to help people.
I'm fascinated by the fact that you're a chemical engineer. I'm a supply chain professional now as well, but I started as a civil engineer. And, the same thing, right? I built bridges and roads, and, that's the career I picked. And then the company that I was working for ended up implementing SAP, and I was tapped on the shoulder to say, hey, you're the young guy. You like this stuff, which was in the mid-90s, by the way. And I did. I kind of like, this is amazing, because now you can see the integration, right, of things fitting together. They're not in silos. They actually can work. And I mean, this is back in the R3 days of things, but it was the beginning of me falling in love with supply chains. And then, of course, supply chains turned into, hey, there's a commercial benefit to supply chains, and there's a benevolent side of it. So for me, I love the idea of supply chains bringing shelter, food, and water to those that need it.
Yes.
That's a supply chain too. It's not commercially just in place for those businesses, but it's actually helping others. So that's a big part of our heartbeat as a company too, because for us, it isn't just about making companies make more money. That's great, right? But it's also about what do we do with that good knowledge around that. And anyway, as an engineer moving into this space, integration was a big thing for me, recognizing the value of integration.
Mm-hmm.
How do you believe that companies are capitalizing on the integration abilities of technology and then the integration ability of people? And maybe those are both two questions.
I actually can find a whole series of questions out of that. First of all, what is integration?
Right.
I don't think we think enough about that. I think a lot of times people think it's data going through an API versus the usability of that data or the visibility for multiple functions to see the same data, or the use of the system of record to track how well we're doing. And I think that the movement of data between applications really should be about interoperability, and we need to work on the semantic level. But the integration of views and the ability for functional work that can improve cross-functional decision-making is totally underused. I mean, people just don't understand that. And I think it comes back to the fact that in the 1990s, we had regional supply chains, and those regional supply chains served local markets. And if we think about the supply chain as a complex nonlinear system, a small supply chain is easy to understand, right? I can go to the channel and I can see my product, and I probably can go to a manufacturing line, put on my safety shoes and my hard hat, and I can experience the factory, and I can ride a truck, and I can understand the dynamics. But when I get into a global multinational, we never helped those processes grow up to really drive the value of the system of record that is available in an integrated way for the use of multiple functions. Mm-hmm. We weren't clear about governance of what is the role of the region, what is the role of the division, what is the role of global, what's the cultural fit. So a company like Unilever is very regional. A company like Procter & Gamble has certain functions that are global and regional. We never really defined governance around how do we use that data. And we never really defined what good looks like in the use of that data. Yeah, we did at a process level, but not really at a measurement level. We've been batting around the term S&OP and inventory for years, but I recently did some work on inventory, and very few companies understand inventory health or the form and function of inventory. And, as we went from the regional supply chain to the global multinational, safety stock went from about 45% of total inventory to about 15% of inventory. But people aren't measuring the other elements of stock of in transit or cycle stock, or what we're doing around the special promotions that we're doing. And so the term integration, I think, was valuable for regional, but even more valuable for the global multinational. And the gap is even bigger for the global multinational. And so I think part of that is the fact that we implemented technology, not a way of working. And we never really defined, when I talk about design, we started out talking about atoms and time, but we didn't talk about how should an organization work culturally to improve reliability, to serve customers. And I think that whole common view is a great opportunity, particularly for the global multinational.
Yeah, and I love that what you said there, because obviously, as you think of how complex things have become, we tend to think of them in microcosms, right? Like mini supply chains, but they all make up a big, long value chain at some point. And the integration of that has been the challenge forever. Like the ERPs were trying to overcome that. And just with the complexity of things, it's becoming worse. And I think where I hear a lot of organizations, they'll say, we need more flexibility. And I often argue, no, it's not flexibility you need, it's agility that you need. Because flexibility is somewhat individual in nature. Like I want to be able to be more flexible. I want to be able to maneuver things around. But if you become agile as a supply chain, that means if you make a decision to move a product, or you're going to reintroduce something in a different market, or you're going to change your suppliers, you literally are changing just the parameters within the technology, and it adjusts. There's no 5-week long program to make everything change. It's literally following the data flow, because then the product will follow accordingly. And I think agility is actually probably more superior sometimes than resilience. Because resilience is somewhat like I come back to where I was, where agility actually capitalizes on the changes that happen.
When somebody engages me in that kind of discussion, I always go, okay, red flag, let's define terms. Mm-hmm. And often people want more flexible system to really embrace maverick behavior. ERP is not designed for maverick behavior. And alignment is so critical, and most organizations aren't aligned. And I define agility as the ability to have the same cost, quality, and customer service given the level of demand and supply variability. Mm-hmm. Most companies don't measure either variability, and they're not clear on the fact that multiple supply chains have multiple flows. So typically in a supply chain, you've got about 20% of the flow that can be efficient, which is lowest cost. And that's when you have a very predictable demand and a very predictable supply. But as we've elongated the tail and we've made the supply chains more complex, then a lot of my items aren't forecastable. I work with companies that have 80% of the items that are not forecastable at an item level. I can't just apply the old-fashioned demand concepts there. I've got to come up in the hierarchy or think about attribute-based forecasting, or go to a configure to order or a make to order model. And, as you think about that in terms of agility, I think we've got to start with what is the root cause of variability. And then when we think about responsiveness, which is the time to respond, the cycle, I find it ironic that e-commerce has made our cycles smaller in many of our industries, but our time to respond is even longer. I did some research on the downturns in the market, the 2007, 2008 recession, and then also with COVID. And I asked the question, how long did it take you to sense the market shift? Mm-hmm. And then how long did it take you to adapt your supply chain for the shift? The best in class were able to sense within 2 months and respond within 6 weeks after that. But the average company took 3 to 4 months to sense and 3 to 4 months to adapt. And a lot of that is we aren't good at the use of data and sensing and adjusting, and we're not data-driven, and we don't understand the patterns of the supply chain.
You hit on something really key, and it reminded me of a story of a local company in Chicago, and it was pre-COVID. And they were underutilizing SAP in particular, and they were just struggling. They just didn't know what they didn't know, mm-hmm. right? We came in, we helped them figure out how to use it effectively, and they got really into the whole demand planning and supply planning, getting a little more predictability in the whole end-to-end. And then COVID happened. And so firstly, they got value out of that, mm-hmm. right? Clearly, there were some inventory improvements, et cetera. Then COVID happened, and they were a industrial floor cleaning manufacturer. So they built those machines that clean, the malls and the factories and stuff. They also had a chemical product that they went. And guess what happened? They were selling 80% of those equipment pre-COVID. And when COVID hit, the demand for that fell through the floor.
Right.
And the chemical products flew because everyone wanted to clean things, right? Due to the parasites and stuff. Anyway, the long and the short of it is because they had an optimal system in place and they understood the agility and which levers to pull as opposed to 4 weeks. They shifted everything, demand, and everything followed because of that. And they were producing more chemicals to meet the market. They doubled in size in 2 years. One of the reason I think they were able to adapt pretty quickly, even though they were smaller in comparison to larger ones, is because they knew they followed the information. So the data led them through the process.
So they were data-driven.
They were data-driven, which meant they were pulled as opposed to they were pushing the rock uphill, as you would say. And so they weren't like that originally, and then they became like that. And then what happens is when you become data-driven and you know what levers or parameters to change, to adjust, you do that.
Yeah, but did their metrics allow them to do that? Because I have a hypothesis that in the large organizations, particularly sales, marketing, finance, that when the markets start to go down, they fight it. And they try to write checks they can't cash. I don't care how much you discount a product if people don't want to buy it. You may ship it into the channel, but it's not going to move.
Yeah, I guess that's fair too, right? I mean, but the philosophy of let's come back to the larger organization, right? And let's put the demand for the product aside for a second. If they are data oriented and they are living in the system and the system is actually guiding their day-to-day actions, and they're not managing transactions, they're managing the levers, the parameters, the master data, for lack of a better term, they have the agility because they literally are changing MRP settings, lead times, lot sizes. They are changing demand signals, supply signals, constraints, throughput rates, etc. And so they're doing that. And if they know where to do that, then the data changes and then the activity changes and follows. And so I do think, and what I've seen, large organizations are able to change pretty quickly, but they have to be data-led. They have to be pulling themselves through the system.
To me, it's about flow. And I think some of it ties to order latency. How off of the market is the order? If the channel has a short order cycle and they're close to the channel, they can sense that better. But if it's a long order latency, meaning it's a low volume product and it goes through replenishment,
Right.
It takes a long time to get an order, like analgesics will have a 4 to 6 month order latency, right? Then, if they're not using market data, they can be data driven, but they're on the back foot.
That's true. So you mentioned earlier to me that prior to your supply chain world, you were also involved with organizational development, specifically people, right? And people are still such a big part of businesses, supply chains. I mean, supply chains exist because of people, right? And so I wanted to ask a couple questions on the people side, but let me start with this one. What do you think is the biggest leadership behavior that is lacking, that's causing some supply chain leaders or businesses to really achieve the results they're looking for?
So at a leadership and behavior level, I am a big proponent of principle-based leadership and understanding of first principles. And when we're dealing with a large organization, alignment of those metrics to those principles and managing the organization in that manner. I think that a mistake that many companies have made is not understanding the technology. And I'm not talking about how to change settings or, how to do workarounds, but understanding at a first principle what this should be and what good looks like. And the second thing that I've observed in large organizations that become very political, I find that a lot of the leaders are very competitive and they actually will flame the fires of those politics versus using influence management and storytelling to help people to understand the real world opportunities and issues in the supply chain. I did a podcast with Keith Harrison, who's one of the people that I really admire. He was 19 years leading the supply chain organization at Procter & Gamble. And he talked about how important it was to tell stories, and when you do, put yourself in the shoes of the person that is on the executive team that you're working with, and to be able to sell the essence of the story in the way that they understand it. And I see many supply chain leaders lack that ability for influence management, storytelling, and really the base understanding of the first principles of technologies and establishing the principles of behavior for the organization. And I think that's an opportunity in most organizations.
I would agree 100%, especially the storytelling part. That really resonates with me. I think any leader needs to be a good storyteller, right? Because people follow that. They listen, they can resonate, they see themselves in those stories, especially if there's some version of a hero involved. But I think one of the things that I've found with behavior is that there's often a lack of value thinking versus cost thinking, where a lot of supply chain leaders are just cost, reduce costs, and they're not seeing necessarily, hey, what can I do to create value? How do I bring value to the business? Sometimes it means I have more inventory in certain areas, and sometimes I have less in others, depending on what's needed. I know value is important to you as well. Talk to me about that.
In 2013, I started Supply Chain Insights, and I had worked at a company called the Gartner Group, and I left Gartner because I don't believe in the business model. I really spent all my time at Gartner talking to the late stage IT adopters, and I really like working with business leaders that are early innovators. And so I went to a company called AMR Research and had the great opportunity for 8 years to work with, thousands of companies on their supply chain strategy and technology. And that was a great time when we were building the global multinational and we were building value networks. And I thought I would work there until I retired. And then Gartner bought AMR, and I'm like, I got to start my own company, and I don't really want to do that. And I said, well, let me write a book that really reflects all of my experiences with the clients. And so I wrote the book, Bricks Matter, and I sent it to people to read. And I had made a statement in the book that supply chain excellence is about the development of value and delivery of value. And when we focus on cost, that we understate the value. So I sent it to people to read, and the people that I most admire said, we agree with this statement. The problem is you didn't define value. And there is nothing in the industry that clearly defines value, which put me on a 10-year journey to try to understand value. So I started with building regression models using metrics, and I sat on the back row of my statistics class, and there was lots of statistically inaccurate things that I did. And I had a person at Intel who pulled me aside and said, you need some really deep statistical work. So he introduced me to a great PhD at Arizona State University. He looked at collinearity of the metrics and the patterns of the metrics and helped me with building regressions in the first work that I did with the supply chain to admire. And then I worked on the patterns at the intersections of the metrics based upon his work. We built the regression models, and then we started looking at orbit charts to look at the patterns of what was the potential of an industry. And I observed that the 28 industries that I was following were actually going backward at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns, and that there was no economy of scale as companies got larger. And I became very curious about that. But I wanted to validate it last year because I had been working on this methodology for the last 12 years. And I wanted to be able to assess the objective function of what defined value, which was the request of 2013. And I know this is a long story, so just bear
No,
with me.
it's all good.
And we tried a lot of different objective measurements. We tried EVA, we tried economic value add,
Right.
and we tried the fundamental score, which is used by the financial organizations following manufacturers, which is a horrible metric, by the way. And we tried market cap, and then we decided on market cap per employee. And the reason why we decided on market cap per employee for public companies was the ratio actually helped me to equivocate large companies and small companies.
Mm-hmm.
And it also was very relatable for the financial organizations. I define value as the ability to have predictable market cap per employee and to be able to deliver at a better rate to the peer group.
And for private companies?
For private companies, I will default to EVA as the next closest proxy.
And how does inventory play a role for you? Because if you think of supply chains, we talked about quantity and time earlier, right? At the end of the day, we often say, just for simplistic sake, is that inventory is a symptom of the process, right? If we don't have efficient processes and stuff, we buffer and we add inventory. How much of does inventory represent? Let's say inventory performance, turns, however you want to set that, as a measure for the effectiveness of a supply chain.
Well, inventory is our most important buffer. We have 3 buffers in the supply chain. Right. Time that we talked about earlier, capacity, and inventory. It's our most important buffer because most people are running their manufacturing plants heavily utilized and they don't have a lot of capacity. And we already talked about the issues around time, that we're not good at managing time cycles. So I need to understand the role of inventory as a buffer. But it's also the biggest source of waste because people aren't disciplined in their use of inventory, and they don't look at inventory in terms of the form and function of inventory of, should I hold a finished good, a semi-finished good, a raw material, and that's really based upon forecastability and supply reliability, and also the process of configured order and make to order, and people aren't clear in their minds about those processes. And the second thing is, what is the function of that inventory? Is it safety stock, cycle stock, in transit stock, seasonal build? And really being clear on those targets. And I find seldom is a company clear on the role of inventory at a form and function level and what's needed at a buffer level and what is waste. And I think that's a great opportunity for most companies.
And I love the buffer concept because it is so important, right? To your point about the capacity constraints, but it's also the easiest one for people to overuse.
Yes.
Right? I'll add more, right? I'll add more and I'll put more away so that I can deal with those inefficiencies and stuff. And to your point, that's waste then. So how do you then measure those turns, right? Not how do you measure it? How do turns then actually show performance? Because of course, if I increase my turns, that means I'm making more money. Therefore, EBITDA goes up. Everything starts getting better. That usually also means the more productive I am, the more efficient I am, the more I'm using my technology correctly, the less inventory I'll also hold because I'm starting to actually manage it as opposed to just buffering.
Well, let's get to the form and function of inventory, right?
Okay.
Because safety stock is now only about 15% of inventory in the global multinational. But, as we've changed our trade lanes and as inbounds have become more variable because of unloading or blank sailings or just inefficiency in international trade, which we've got a lot of that, I have more in-transit inventory, and I've got to manage that in-transit inventory. Maybe I shouldn't have in-transit inventory. Maybe I should have shorter trade lanes. Maybe I should have push-pull decoupling points and postponement. But that whole design of the inventory system, back to my design and modify, is something that people don't think about enough. The other thing is I can't just cut inventory. I worked with Kimberly Clark when the CFO wanted to just slice inventory for the earnings call, and then they weren't able to meet orders and their competitor got market share. So the understanding of inventory to form and function and inventory targets is not well understood by the financial group and is usually a great opportunity. And I find simulation capabilities or discrete event simulation or what if analysis is usually very good to show people the impact of the form and function of inventory and inventory targets. People feel like, well, I'm just going to have more inventory and therefore I'll be more effective. But too much inventory is horrible. It's like having a house that's cluttered or,
That's right.
a hoarder. I can't get through the warehouse, right? And so the right sizing of inventory is so critical. And back to the value statement, for 28 industries, we found that for 26, inventory plays a key role in that regression analysis. And so I look at inventory, not cash to cash, because inventory I can measure discretely, whereas cash to cash is a compound metric. And I find that inventory levels have gone up, and people think, wow, I've improved cash to cash. But what we've done is we've increased payables. So cash to cash is receivables plus inventory minus payables. So if we don't pay the bloke down the street, yeah, we've increased payables and we may feel good about cash to cash, but we're not helping.
No, that bloke around down the street's going to probably raise his prices later again because you're not
Exactly.
paying.
Or not serve you as a customer.
That's right. So we would be remiss to not talk about AI and the AI era, right? Even though we've been talking a lot about data and analysis and data, following data, etc. But if, with all of your background and all of your experience, if you were advising a CEO, or even if we just say a chief supply chain officer, somebody of that ilk, what would you say they should not do with AI?
Well, the first thing is they shouldn't use the term AI without a definition. AI means so many different things, and I love the fact that we have the confluence of technology. The second thing is I don't think we should AI stupid. And to me, AI stupid is really putting agents at the top level of the stack versus I think we have to build artificial intelligence capabilities from the bottom of the stack up, really looking at the data that's not used, the semantic reconciliation, looking at interoperability, industry knowledge levels, cleaning of data, which is a great use case for machine learning, and then looking at how do we use things like large language models with agents to be able to drive insight for companies in a way that they don't have it today. So, for example, today business leaders have to ask planners for a new plan. Well, what if they had a digital assistant that they could talk to a Siri-like LLM, large language model, and do what if analysis and then be able to go have a beer with a colleague and talk about perhaps we could do it like this versus like that. Or they could get agentic alerts when, they have something that's going to go wrong before it's actually an issue, an early warning signal. So I don't think we're doing enough thinking about the redefinition of work. And I liken it a lot to the 1980s when we didn't have computers. And when I used to be a young kid out of school and I went in my factory in the morning, I had a secretarial pool that gave me an index card. And the index card was designed to fit in a man's pocket. And of course, I didn't have a man's pocket, so I never knew what to do with it. But it basically told me what my meetings were for the day and kind of, what the plan was, right? And I never typed my own memos. I always gave them to the typing pool, and we had interoffice mail. And it would usually take 2 to 3 days for a letter to go from my typing pool to my corporate, and then it would probably take 5 days for me to get a response. We didn't have email. And there was a computer that we brought to the office, and it actually took 3 people to get through the doorway, and we used to have to sign up in 1-hour slots to use the computer. And we all thought, well, the computer's all going to take our jobs, and we were scared. But the typing pool, the folks there were smart. They stopped arguing about Word versus WordPerfect, and they started building different skills. One person became a database manager, and one person went to HR and did HR administration. And so they looked for opportunities. But the redesign of work was what was fascinating, because now we all had to learn how to type, and we all had to learn how to use these computers and how to do our own letters. And then email was just an amazing redefinition of work. And I don't think we've done enough thinking about the role of email and redesign of work from that period. But I think there's a lot we can learn about. It's not about AI for AI. It's about the redefinition of work, and hopefully it'll make it better. And it's not about AI taking jobs. It's about AI opening the door for new opportunities that smart people are going to jump into. And it's not about the world we know, but it's the world we imagine. And we would never have imagined, ERP or APS in the 1980s. It just wasn't on our agenda. I remember trying to even conceive what a spreadsheet was when I read about it in Newsweek magazine, right? So I think that it comes down to first principles, management of teams, and redesign of work. And hopefully we'll have a better place out of all this.
I love that. It's a nice way to end the technology conversation. Before we leave, I would like to ask, outside of all of this intellectual research and thinking that you do, what do you do for fun?
Oh.
If that's not fun, let's assume that's fun anyway. Who's Lora?
Well, Lora aspires to be a great writer. One of the things I enjoy about my job is writing. And I feel very honored that almost 350,000 people around the world read my writing. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah, congratulations on that.
I'm just, every day I look at it and the number keeps growing, and I'm so thankful and humbled that, this had happened. But I work on writing. I love to write. I'm amazed that the words that come from my fingers, I'm not in really processing. It's like the mind connects to the fingers and you're typing things you're not even present to realize. So I love writing. I'm a gardener. I have great passion for gardening, much to my family's chagrin, right? But it's good for my body, it's good for my mind, and I love to garden. And I try to stay physically active. I take ballet. My goal is to do a double pirouette on point before I die, and hopefully I've got 10 years left because I'm not quite there. And, I swim and I run, and I have 3 Skye Terriers, and they're all grand champions. And I'm a quilter. I have a little quilting retail business, and I design quilts and spend my spare time quilting. And I like to be creative, and I like to give back. So, yeah.
What a diverse characteristics of things that makes you so human, and I appreciated that so much. I feel closer to you already just knowing that you have so many more things to offer. And I love the double pirouette, by the way. I'm going to want to see that at some point.
Well, I'll show you the calluses on my feet from my point shoes. But I'm just a small town girl that grew up in the mountains of West Virginia that somehow found herself in the world of supply chain. And, I have a daughter, and my daughter took a master's class, and she said, Mom, I didn't know that you would Google so well.
I love that. Well, on that note, thank you.
Thank you.
This has been such a pleasure. I really appreciate the time. Your insights are fascinating, and I love being in your presence. This was great. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, thank you.
Yeah.